Single dad rescued a billionaire, then left without a word. The Bentley hit the oak tree with a sound that split the quiet Pennsylvania morning, metal shrieking glass scattering like ice. Inside, a woman lay bloodied and still, her life balanced on seconds. On that deserted stretch of Route 12, Ben Carter slammed on the brakes of his rusty pickup, his 8-year-old son staring wide-eyed beside him. Ben didn't think, didn't hesitate. He ran toward the wreckage, toward fire and broken steel, and pulled her out with his bare hands. She would survive. He would vanish, and what began as a single act of courage would tear open 2 lives already scarred by loss. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story reaches. The world broke apart at 6:47 a.m. On an otherwise silent stretch of Route 12, a silver Bentley careened out of its lane tires, screeching, before slamming head-on into an ancient oak tree that had stood there for a century. The sound was like thunder shattering the dawn metal, twisting glass, bursting into shards that glittered across the asphalt. Steam hissed from the mangled hood, curling into the frosted Pennsylvania morning like white ghosts. Inside the old Ford pickup that trailed 100 yards behind Ben Carter's hands tightened on the wheel. His son Jacob jolted upright beside him, the crayon he'd been clutching tumbling to the floor. "Dad." The boy gasped, his brown eyes wide. Ben's foot was already on the brake. The truck skidded to a halt at the roadside. He turned sharply to his son. "Stay here. Don't move." His voice carried the clipped firmness of a man who'd seen crisis before a tone Jacob had never learned to question. Ben shoved open the door boots, crunching against gravel, and sprinted toward the wreck. The morning air bit cold into his lungs, carrying with it the acrid stench of leaking fuel. The Bentley's front end was folded in on itself, its windshield spider-webbed with cracks. Through the haze of smoke and steam, Ben saw her slumped over the wheel, platinum hair matted with blood, an arm twisted at an unnatural angle. "Hang on," he muttered under his breath, a prayer and a promise in the same breath. He grabbed the driver's handle, jammed. He yanked harder, the metal cutting into his palm. No give. He sprinted to the passenger side. That door was crumpled but not locked. Planting a shoulder against it, he shoved until something snapped and the frame popped open with a shriek that echoed across the trees. The interior reeked of gasoline and blood. Shards of glass glittered across the leather seats. He crawled in, ignoring the sting as a piece sliced his forearm. "You're not dying here," he growled, hooking one arm beneath her back and the other under her knees. Her body was light, frighteningly so limp against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breath shallow, but still there. Outside, Jacob had pressed his small face to the truck's window, knuckles white on the glass. Ben caught his son's gaze for half a heartbeat, a silent reassurance before turning away and carrying the woman onto the frosted grass. He knelt, laying her gently down, checking for a pulse. Faint, fluttering. He ripped off his flannel overshirt, balling it against the gash at her temple. Blood seeped through warm against his calloused hands. Jacob's voice carried muffled but urgent. "Dad? Is she okay?" "She's alive," Ben called back, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "Get back in the truck." The boy hesitated, then obeyed, climbing inside, though his wide eyes never left his father. Ben kept pressure on the wound, whispering nonsense. "You're all right, you're safe, stay with me," as though his words alone could keep her tethered to this world. The sirens came faint at first, then closer, growing louder until red lights flashed across the morning mist. Tires screeched, paramedics poured out. Ben backed away, letting them swarm her with oxygen masks. Lines practiced efficiency. One of them looked up. "Were you the one who pulled her out?" Ben only nodded, wiping blood from his hands onto his jeans. He gave no name, no number, just stood there until they hoisted her onto the gurney. As they slid her into the ambulance, something small slipped from Ben's jacket pocket onto the hospital blanket, a worn wooden pencil chipped from years of use. He didn't notice. The back doors slammed, the siren wailed, and just like that she was gone, carried away into the distance. Ben turned, walking back to the pickup. His son leaned out the open window, voice trembling. "Aren't we going with them?" Ben shook his head, his boots heavy against the asphalt. "Not our world, Jacob." He climbed behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled away. In the rearview mirror, the red lights dwindled, spinning smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the fog. He never learned her name. But the world would Alexandra Whitmore heiress to a $3 billion art empire. And though she would wake hours later in a hospital bed alive because of him, she would have no idea who had saved her. Because Ben Carter vanished into the Pennsylvania morning, without a word, leaving behind nothing but a ghost of kindness and a wooden pencil that would haunt her every day that followed. The town of Millbrook lived on routine. Every morning the church bell rang at 7, its deep toll rolling over rooftops and bouncing along narrow streets. The diner opened 15 minutes later, the clang of coffee cups and the hiss of bacon on the griddle loud enough to drift through the frosty air. The paperboy tossed rolled gazettes onto porches with practiced accuracy, and old men on corner benches nodded to one another as if each day was a continuation of the last. For Ben Carter, routine wasn't comfort, it was survival. By the time the bell rang, he was already out back in the garage behind his weather-worn house on Maple Street, wrench in hand. The building leaned slightly from decades of storms, but the bay door still rolled up with a groan, and inside it smelled of oil rust and determination. Ben had built this garage with Linda, his wife, back when they still thought the future stretched endless. She had held boards while he hammered painted the walls a cheerful blue, even planted marigolds outside to soften the smell of grease. Now, years after cancer had stolen her, the paint was faded and the flowers long gone, but the place remained both sanctuary and lifeline. Engines of every kind rolled into his care farm trucks with rusted fenders, sedans with mysterious rattles, the occasional BMW whose owner was surprised that a small-town mechanic could do what dealerships couldn't. Ben's hands, scarred, strong, calloused, moved over them with patience. He coaxed engines back to life the way other men might coax music from a guitar. And in the corner after school, Jacob sat on a stool with his sketchbook balanced on his knees. The boy rarely said much, but the scratch of his pencil filled the silence steady as breath. He always drew families. Mothers and fathers holding hands with children, trees sheltering them overhead. Sometimes he drew his mother from memory, her long hair the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed. Sometimes he drew himself between both parents, a world that no longer existed but lived fiercely on paper. Ben saw every page, though Jacob never offered them. The drawings were both beautiful and devastating. Inside the house, Linda lingered everywhere. Her coffee mug still sat in the cabinet untouched, but not forgotten. Her garden tools hung in the shed, clean but idle. And in the backyard, carved deep into the oak's bark, their initials still rested within a heart, B+L. That tree had once been their promise of forever. Now it was just a reminder of everything temporary. Ben carried his grief differently than his son. He never spoke of it directly, but he taught Jacob that pain wasn't something you got over, it was something you carried. Like love, only heavier. When the boy asked questions late at night, Ben always answered honestly, even if the truth was hard. Mrs. Patterson, the widow next door, became their guardian angel in casserole form. Twice a week she knocked with a covered dish, insisting she was only testing new recipes. But her eyes always scanned Ben's face, searching for cracks. "You're working too hard, Benjamin," she said, once setting a lasagna on the counter. "I've got bills," he replied gently, steering her back toward the door. "But thank you." "Really?" Pride had been Linda's word for it. Stubbornness she'd teased, though her smile softened the sting. Without her, pride became Ben's armor. He never asked for help, never leaned too heavily on anyone. But sometimes late at night, when the house grew too quiet, he wondered how long a man could carry everything alone. Jacob noticed more than his father thought. He'd sit cross-legged on the living room rug, sketchbook open, stealing glances at Ben, falling asleep in his chair, grease still under his nails. The boy absorbed every lesson without a word. Resilience, endurance, strength masked as silence. One crisp morning, as Ben drove Jacob to school in the old pickup, the boy turned, clutching his wooden pencil, his mother's pencil worn nearly to the stub. "Dad," he asked softly, "do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" The question lodged in Ben's chest like a blade. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Normal changes, buddy, but we'll be okay as long as we have each other." Jacob looked down at his sketchbook, then back out the window. He didn't argue, but his silence said more than words could. That afternoon, Ben returned to the garage, the weight of school fees looming heavy in his mind. One more month and the bills would outpace his work. He bent over a truck engine jaw set, forcing himself to believe he could make it work. He always had. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that far away in a tower of glass and steel, the woman he had pulled from a wreck was staring at a wooden pencil lying on her mahogany desk. Her name was Alexandra Whitmore. She owned an empire built on priceless art, yet she couldn't stop staring at an object worth less than a dime. Because that pencil dropped from Ben's pocket as he carried her from the wreck was the only clue to the man who had saved her life without leaving a name. And Alexandra was not a woman who tolerated mysteries, especially not when her very survival was bound up in them. In Manhattan, the skyline cut sharp against the morning haze, a forest of glass and steel that glittered like it had never known loss. Alexandra Whitmore sat in her office atop the Whitmore Foundation Tower, her desk a sleek slab of mahogany polished to a mirror. Beneath it, her high heels tapped nervously, an irregular percussion against silence. Her assistant droned on, listing mergers, auction catalogs, board schedules, but Alexandra wasn't listening. Not really. Her gaze had drifted again to the object lying just inches from her manicured hands. A wooden pencil worn smooth with used teeth marks, dimpling its shaft. Something so ordinary it should have been swept away with hospital linens, yet here it was her talisman. She remembered waking in a hospital bed 2 weeks ago, bandaged sore, her father's lawyer hovering by the door with clipped concern. The doctor spoke of concussion and bruised ribs. She listened, but her mind kept circling back to fragments of memory, a man's steady voice urging her to hold on. Arms strong around her, the smell of motor oil and flannel. She never saw his face clearly, and then gone. She lifted the pencil again, rolled it between her fingers. In her world, everything had a price, yet he had taken nothing, not even his name. That kind of selflessness didn't fit the rules she lived by, and it gnawed at her. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Her private investigator, Watson, entered, gray suit, pressed hair, combed with clinical neatness. The man had been on her payroll for years, discreet in a way her family required. He held a folder. "I found him," Watson said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact. He laid the file down, the weight of it heavier than steel. Alexandra's pulse jumped. She flipped it open. Benjamin Carter. 34. Widowed. One son, Jacob, 8 years old, lives in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Owns a one-man auto repair shop. Watson's words kept steady as Alexandra's eyes darted across the grainy surveillance photos paper-clipped inside. In one, Ben bent under the hood of a truck, forearms corded with grease and strength. In another, the boy Jacob sat nearby, sketchbook, open, a pencil scratching furiously. Alexandra studied the images until they blurred. She whispered the name under her breath. Benjamin Carter. He has no debts. Beyond the ordinary. Watson continued. No record. By all accounts, he's decent. Decent. The word felt foreign in her world of contracts and negotiations. When Watson left, Alexandra stayed still staring at the photos. This man had saved her life and walked away. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she needed to know why. But she also knew this: if she showed up as Alexandra Whitmore, heiress and CEO, she would poison it. Wealth created walls. Her name alone would draw expectation, gratitude, maybe resentment. What she wanted was something rarer: authenticity. That night in her penthouse, she stood before a gilded mirror. The woman reflected back was perfect tailored suit, diamond earrings, posture sharpened by years of scrutiny, a mask. She began to strip it away. The next day, she bought thrift store clothes that smelled faintly of mothballs and laundry soap. She learned to do her own makeup, imperfect smudges replacing professional precision. She practiced in front of the mirror, softening her voice, unlearning the commanding cadence that had made men twice her age flinch in boardrooms. Piece by piece, Alexandra Whitmore faded. Allie Mitchell emerged. Allie rented a modest apartment an hour outside Millbrook. She cooked her own meals, burning eggs at first, laughing alone in a way that felt strange but freeing. She bought a Honda Civic from a used lot, its radio preset to stations with more static than music. Each step drew her further from her empire and closer to the truth she sought. On a crisp October morning, Allie steered the Civic down Millbrook's winding back roads. Gold and scarlet leaves spun across the windshield. Her stomach twisted with nerves foreign to her. She'd negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking. But this driving toward a small-town garage toward a man who didn't even know her name shook her. The sign came into view: Carter Auto Repair. The garage door yawned open. Music faint from an old radio. Ben Carter was there, bent over a transmission, his back broad beneath a faded t-shirt, his hands stained with grease. Allie sat in the car for a long moment, palms damp on the steering wheel. She rehearsed the line. "My car is making a noise. Can you look at it?" Finally, she stepped out. Gravel crunched under her boots. She walked to the counter, clutching her purse tighter than necessary. Ben wiped his hands on a rag and glanced up. Their eyes met for the first time, not savior, and saved not billionaire and mechanic, but two strangers in a garage smelling of oil and autumn air. "Morning," he said, voice steady low. "Morning," Ali replied, her voice carefully casual. "I think my car's making a strange sound. Could you check it?" Ben nodded, already reaching for her keys. It might have ended there, routine professional. But then Jacob wandered in, sketchbook in hand. Ali's gaze softened, and without thinking, she knelt. "What are you drawing?" she asked. The boy's face lit like sunrise, and for Ben Carter, who had convinced himself miracles no longer existed, something shifted, quiet, dangerous, and undeniable. The Honda's hood clanged shut, and the sound bounced around the cinderblock walls like a cue that life could be simple again. Ben wiped his hands on a red shop rag until the grease left dark galaxies across the cotton. He straightened, rolled his shoulders, and met the stranger's the customer's eyes. "Loose belt," he said. 20 minutes. $37. Ali blinked. 37? Ben almost smiled. Folks from out of town reacted that way sometimes, like honesty was an unexpected item in the bagging area. "Parts and labor," he added, reaching for the old carbon copy pad on the counter. "I can print a receipt if you want it for your records." "Please," she said, as if the word tasted new. She fished in her purse and pulled out crisp 20s, so fresh they still remembered rubber bands. Jacob drifted closer, sketchbook hugged to his chest like a favorite toy. He wasn't a boy who interrupted adults, but he hovered near Ali's elbow, peeking up with the cautious brightness of a kid deciding whether a person was safe. Ali lowered herself to his height without thinking, resting on the toes of her thrift store boots. "What are you drawing today?" she asked. Jacob's chin dipped shy but eager. He flipped to a page. A tree spread its branches across the paper-thick trunk carved with a faint heart. Two initials, B+L, hid in the bark. Light fell through the leaves in pencil strokes so delicate they felt like breath. "This is beautiful," Ali said softly. She pointed with the gentleness of someone handling museum glass. "See how your lines go one direction? If you cross-hatch small strokes at an angle, you'll get shadow that feels like it's wrapping around the bark. Try here." She angled her pencil, demonstrating tiny strokes that built depth. Jacob copied her, the world narrowing to graphite and grain. "Like this, exactly like that." She looked up at Ben, a flicker in her eyes as though she wanted to ask permission to praise his child. "He has a real eye, Mr. Carter." "Ben," he corrected slower than he meant to. "You can call me Ben." "Ali," she said. And the name landed between them like a stone skipping across water. 1, 2, 3, ripples and gone. She slid the money across the counter and tucked the receipt into her purse as though she were collecting proof that people like him existed. The afternoon light slanted through the garage door dust, turning into glitter in the beam. The radio crackled out an oldies station, where the DJ sounded like a cousin. A space heater hummed near the wall, fighting a losing battle against the October air. Ordinary life filled in around them, modest and complete. "Need anything else?" Ben asked. "No." She hesitated, then glanced at Jacob's notebook again. "Actually, is there a place in town that sells sketching paper? Good paper?" Ben shook his head. "You'll find printer paper and spiral notebooks. For the good stuff, folks drive to reading." He saw the flicker of something in her face. Surprise. Maybe that a place could run just fine without specialty stores on every corner. "We make do," he added. She smiled, not in pity, but in respect. Making do looks like a kind of art. Her Civic rattled freshly quiet now and rolled away down the gravel. Jacob watched from the bay like a kid watches the last float pass at a parade. Ben pretended not to notice. "Wash up, champ," he said, tipping his head toward the utility sink. "We'll close early today. Can we drive to Reading sometime?" Jacob asked as he scrubbed his hands, dark swirls clouding the water. "For paper, we'll see." Ben said, which was the kindest form of money's tight he knew how to give. Ali came back 3 days later. "There's a noise," she said, sheepish. "A new one. Describe it." Ben said, already leaning across the counter to listen to the engine, even though he didn't need to. He could tell a Honda's problem by the way the hood shook, the way the whole chassis breathed. Like a chirp. Maybe. She winced at her own vagueness. "I'm not very good at car words." Ben nodded like she'd confessed something holy. "Most people aren't." He lifted the hood, ran a finger along a pulley, and found the belt notched just enough to sing when cold. "I'll tune it. 30 minutes. Do you mind if I—" She gestured toward the stool in the corner. Jacob was already there, feet swinging, sketchbook open. He didn't look up, but Ben could tell from the way his shoulders squared that he knew she'd asked. "Suit yourself," he said, and the words sounded gruff only because he couldn't figure out how to make them warm. They fell into a rhythm that felt like a song they'd all known in different lives. Ben worked the delicate concentration of repair, wiping his face clean of worry. Ali sat with Jacob, teaching him how to see shadows in daylight, how to let light sit on top of lines like sugar on fruit. Every so often, Ben would glance over and catch them both bent over the same page. 2 heads, one small one, framed in platinum hair almost touching. "You move like you've done this before," he said once, nodding toward her hand on the page. His tone tried for casual and landed a notch below curious. "I love art," she said, and something in her voice tightened the way a chord tightens before a difficult note. "I mean, I used to help with a community program." She kept her eyes on the paper as if the truth might hide in the grain. "Not recently." Ben let the subject drift like sawdust. He'd learned the hard way that some stories arrive when they're ready, and no sooner. When he finished the tune-up, he wrote the total on the receipt pad and tore off the top sheet. "No charge today," he said, holding it out to her. Ali blinked. "Why not?" "It was nothing, more noise than issue." He shrugged. "Anyway, I already learned something about cross-hatching." Her laugh came out before she could stop it. For a heartbeat, the practiced composure slipped, and the person underneath, unguarded, surprised, looked back at him. "Then I owe you a lesson next time," she said. It hung there, a question wrapped as a promise. She paid anyway, sliding a single 10 across the counter with a small defiance he couldn't name. As she left, she touched the doorframe with her fingertips, a superstitious tap like she was blessing the place. When the Civic pulled away, Jacob turned to his dad with the kind of open hope kids don't bother disguising. "She's nice," he said. "She is Ben allowed. Do you think she'll come back?" Ben distracted himself with the wrench. "Cars do." "What cars do?" he said, which was the kind of answer you give a boy when you can't admit you're wondering the same thing. She did come back. A week of frost later, her Civic rolled in with a politely blinking check engine light. "Those things are suggestions," Ben said, scanning codes with the old reader that beeped like a heart monitor. "You've got a misfire on 2. "Nothing dramatic." "Nothing about cars feels not dramatic," Ali confessed, folding her arms. She wore a wool coat the color of oatmeal and a knit cap that tried hard not to be designer. There was a smear of graphite on her hand. "Except being here. This place feels—" She groped for a word that fit. "Steady. Steady." Ben filed the word away. He didn't know what it meant in her mouth, but it sounded like relief. While he worked, Jacob showed her a new drawing, Main Street, under snow strings of lights like constellations caught in midair. Ali leaned close, pointing to the diner's windows. "You can make glass glow if you leave a thin line of paper white," she said. "Here, let it breathe." Jacob tried it, erasing carefully, the glow appearing like a trick. His grin flashed. "You were right. It happens," she said with a faux arrogance that made the boy laugh. Afterward, Ali lingered by the counter, palms braced on the scarred laminate. "There's a pizza place someone told me about, Pete's. Is it any good?" "It'll change your life," Ben said seriously, then caught how ridiculous the line sounded and winced. "Pizza-wise," he added. "Not in a... you know." She smiled and the air warmed 3 degrees. "Maybe I'll try it." "You should." He hesitated. They do a 2-for-1 on Wednesdays. Good for... He glanced at Jacob. Teams. Teams, she echoed as if savoring the notion. The first time she brought supplies, she tried to make it look like an accident. I bought the wrong paper, she said, setting a pad of cold press on the counter, as carelessly as someone drops pennies. If nobody wants it, I'll just... Jacob's hands were already on it. This is the good kind. It is, she said lightly. To Ben, she added, I found a small art shop near my place. They had a sale. Ben's eyes flicked from the paper to her face. We'll pay you back. No need, it's a sample. She offered the half-lie with a look that asked him not to kill it. He wrestled with his instinct. Pride kept the lights on almost as reliably as customers did, but the way Jacob cradled the pad like it was a door to somewhere it softened him. Thank you, he said, each syllable measured. We'll put it to use. They did. The next hour turned the corner of the garage into a quiet studio. Allie tore a sheet with a practiced hand, taught Jacob how to tape the borders so the page dried crisp. She showed him how a kneaded eraser could pull highlights from shadow like a sunrise. Grease and graphite shared the same air without argument. Near closing, Mrs. Patterson appeared with a casserole as she did twice a week. She peered over Ben's shoulder into the garage. Her gray hair was teased into the same small cloud it had been for a decade, and her curiosity arrived 5 seconds before her voice. Well now, she said, eyes landing on Allie. We've got company. Mrs. Patterson, this is Allie, Ben said. She's a customer. Of course she is, Mrs. Patterson replied, which in small-town dialect meant, I'll have questions later. She handed the casserole to Ben, then leaned toward Jacob's page. My goodness, that looks like our clock tower. It is, Jacob said, glowing. Mrs. Patterson patted his shoulder. Your mama would be proud. She meant it kindly, and the sentence hung a beat too long in the suddenly tender air. Ben cleared his throat. Thank you, he said to both women at once. When Allie left that evening, she paused on the gravel and looked back at the open bay door. See you, Jacob, she called. Keep the light in the glass. I will, he shouted, waving with the enthusiasm of a boy who had remembered how. Ben watched from the threshold, arms folded. The fading sun made everything look like it mattered. He didn't like how much he'd come to look forward to the sound of tires on his gravel. Under his breath to the empty parking pad, he said, Don't make a habit of needing things, Carter. But habits were already forming, the kind that settle into the seams of a life painless and dangerous. That night, as he dried dishes at the sink while Jacob shaded a window brighter, Ben thought of the way Allie had moved in the garage, competent, gentle, present. He thought of her eyes on his son's hands. He thought of $37 and a receipt folded into a purse like a love note to decency. He didn't think of her car. He thought of the person who kept bringing it back, and that made him uneasy in a way he didn't know how to fix. The first snow of the season drifted over the garage like a secret, slow and silent, until it became a fact. By morning, Ben had shoveled the path twice, leaving neat trenches through the powder. Jacob's boots left small moons in the whiteness, tracking to the school bus stop and back. The world smelled of salt and exhaust and pine. The Civic returned that afternoon, its tires crunching through the snowbanks, like someone apologizing with each step. Allie climbed out in a coat of pale gray wool snowflakes clinging to the edges of her hair. She looked less like a customer and more like she belonged in a painting, something about her posture, about how she cupped her hands to her mouth for warmth, then laughed at the fog of her own breath. Engine's fine, she said, before Ben could ask. But the heater, it takes forever. Jacob shouldn't have to freeze while I warm it up. Ben lifted an eyebrow. You could have called a regular shop in the city. Her smile was small, defensive, but honest. I wanted to come here. Jacob abandoned his pencil sharpener and beamed. I can show you my new drawing. He pulled open his sketchbook, revealing Main Street strung with holiday lights. Snow piled on the roof. Allie bent down, resting on her heels in the snow. You drew this from memory, uh-huh. Dad says memory's a good teacher. Your dad's right. She tapped the corner of the page. But you see how the lights don't shine unless you shade the dark behind them. Contrast is what makes them glow. She showed him her glove, clumsy but steady. Ben busied himself with the heater core, but his ears worked fine. He liked the way she spoke to Jacob, not down to him, but across, as if the boy were already an artist, already someone worth listening to. "Needs a new blower motor," Ben said after a while. "Not hard, just time." "Do it," she said without hesitation. "It'll cost—" "Do it," she repeated, and her tone left no space for pride's protest. He nodded, swallowed the instinct to argue. She stepped back, brushing snow from her coat, and drifted near the space heater. The garage was warmer than outside, but not by much. She hugged her arms. "You get used to the cold?" she asked. Never Ben admitted. "You just make peace with it." Something in her eyes softened. "That sounds like more than weather." He looked away, tightening a bolt until the socket squealed. He didn't want to answer questions that weren't really about cars. The repair stretched into the evening, and when it was done, Ben wrote the number on the pad. He hesitated before handing it to her. She read it, nodded, and paid without blinking. Then she surprised him. "Can I buy you both dinner?" He blinked. "Dinner? There's a diner down the street. I passed it on my way in. Seems cozy. I owe Jacob a reward for his art lesson." Jacob looked at his father's eyes, pleading in a way no child could disguise. Ben's instinct was to refuse. Pride again, that old watchdog. But he saw the hunger in Jacob's eyes, not for food, but for company. He sighed. "All right, but we pay for our plates." Ali smiled. "Deal." The diner buzzed with neon and the smell of fried onions. Vinyl booths lined the windows, and the jukebox in the corner played a scratchy Elvis song. Locals nodded to Ben as he entered, the kind of nods that said, "We know you." They noticed Ali too, eyes sliding over her coat, her posture, her quiet grace. Curiosity hummed but didn't touch her. They slid into a booth. Jacob ordered pancakes because pancakes at night are a child's rebellion, and Ali followed his lead with pie. Ben chose coffee as anchor. "This place feels like a movie set," Ali murmured, eyes roaming over the waitress with teased hair, the cook flipping burgers behind the counter. "It's just Pete's," Ben said. "Just Pete's," she repeated as though the words meant more than he allowed. Jacob poured syrup with too much freedom, and Ali laughed, steadying the plate. "You'll have a sugar storm later," she teased. "Worth it." Jacob grinned. The plates clattered, the chatter rose, and for a moment Ben let himself believe this was normal. Two parents and a boy in a booth sharing nothing fancy but everything whole. When the check came, Ali slid it across before Ben's hand could move. "I invited," she said. "Don't fight me." He met her eyes, ready to argue. But something there, a mix of gratitude and insistence, stilled him. He let it go just this once. On the way back, snow fell harder. The street lamps cast cones of light that caught each flake. The Civic purred with its new heater. Warm air fogging the windshield. Jacob fell asleep in the back sketchbook open on his lap. At a stoplight, Ali glanced at Ben. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She hesitated. "Someone rougher, angrier. You work hard, you've lost things. Most people in your position carry it like armor." Ben's jaw tightened. "And you think I don't—" "No," she said softly. "I think you carry it differently, like you don't want your boy to feel it." The light turned green and he didn't answer, but her words lingered all the way back to the garage where she dropped them off. "Thank you," she said as Jacob stirred awake. "For the repair, for everything." Ben nodded, hands shoved in his jacket. He watched her car vanish into the snow, taillights bleeding red against the white. Inside, Jacob yawned. "Dad," he mumbled, "do you think she'll come back again?" Ben didn't answer right away. He set the casserole dish from Mrs. Patterson on the counter, stared at the steam rising when he lifted the foil. Finally, he said, "Cars always need something." But deep down, he knew it wasn't the car bringing her back. The days shortened December, pressing its long nights against the little town. Holiday lights bloomed across porches, their glow spilling over snowdrifts like melted jewels. At Carter Auto, the radio hummed Christmas songs from another era, scratchy but warm, while Ben replaced brake pads and rotated tires. It was the season where loneliness carved deepest. For years, Ben had gotten through by working late, keeping his mind buried in engines. But this year felt different. Maybe it was because Jacob hummed louder when Ali visited, or because Ben found himself watching the road more often, waiting for her Civic to appear. She came again just as twilight painted the street lavender. This time it wasn't the car at all. She carried a box wrapped in brown paper steam, escaping faintly from the edges. "Peace offering," she said, stepping inside the garage. "Homemade chili." "Don't laugh. I had help from a cookbook." Jacob cheered as if Santa had just landed. He tugged her toward the tiny kitchen corner, already setting out bowls. Ben leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "You don't have to keep bringing things." Ali tilted her head. "Maybe I like cooking for someone who actually eats it." He smirked despite himself. "You sure it's edible?" "Try me." The three of them sat around the battered table, the chili surprisingly rich with spice. Jacob declared it the best he'd ever tasted, though he said that about most hot meals. Ben ate slower, savoring not just the food, but the sound of laughter bouncing against the garage walls. It had been a long time since those walls heard joy. When Jacob excused himself to wash his hands, Ali glanced at Ben. "I have a confession," she said. He raised a brow. "That you bribed us with chili." She smiled faintly. "That I'm not just some drifter. I've done well. Very well, actually. But I didn't want to lead with that. I wanted to know what it felt like to just be, without the weight of a last name or expectations." Ben studied her spoon, paused. "So what are you running from husband, family?" Her gaze dropped to the table. "Expectations," she repeated softly. "Maybe a little bit of myself." There was a silence, heavy with things unsaid. Ben could feel the truth straining beneath her words, but he didn't push. Not yet. Later, while Jacob sketched at the counter, Ali helped Ben hang a string of Christmas lights across the garage doorway. They stretched the wire together, her fingers brushing his as she steadied the ladder. It was nothing to touch a laugh when the bulb refused to glow, but for Ben, it felt like stepping into dangerous territory. "Looks better already," she said, squinting at their crooked handiwork. "It's a garage, not Rockefeller Center," he muttered, though the sight of lights twinkling against snow stirred something in him he hadn't let himself feel in years. Jacob clapped. "It's perfect." And maybe for one fleeting second, it was. A week later, Ali showed up again, this time at Jacob's school art fair. She slipped into the cafeteria-turned-gallery wearing a simple scarf, not the kind of woman you'd expect to see among PTA chatter and finger-painted snowmen. Jacob spotted her instantly. "Ali," he shouted, waving his sketchbook like a flag. He dragged her toward his display charcoal drawings of cars, streets, and one that stopped her cold an image of three figures at a diner booth. "That's us," Jacob said proudly. "I drew from memory." Ali's throat tightened. She crouched to meet his eyes. "You drew us as a family." Jacob shrugged, almost shy now. It felt right. From across the room, Ben watched. Parents nodded to him, offering the polite half-smiles small towns kept ready. But his eyes stayed fixed on Ali, kneeling beside his boy, as if she belonged there. Later on the walk home, snow falling thick and soundless, Ali tucked her scarf tighter. "Jacob's incredible. He doesn't just draw objects, he draws heart." Ben nodded. "It's all him, not me." She stopped. "You sell yourself short. You've given him stability, warmth. Do you know how rare that is?" The words hit harder than he expected. He looked away, jaw working. "I just do what I can." They reached the garage, and for a moment neither moved. The night pressed in the Christmas lights, throwing soft halos on their faces. Ali's voice dropped. "You don't know how much you've already given me, too." The air between them shifted, charged. Ben felt his defenses straining, ready to snap, but Jacob's voice from inside cut through, calling for help with hot chocolate. Ben exhaled. "Come in. He'll be disappointed if you don't." She smiled, stepping past him into the warmth. That night, as Jacob drifted to sleep on the couch, Ali lingered by the door. Her coat was buttoned, but her eyes lingered too long on Ben's. "Good night," she whispered. "Night." His voice was rougher than usual. When the door clicked shut, Ben stood still, hands clenched. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted it. But it was here anyway, unfolding in snow and silence, and for the first time in years he wondered if maybe, just maybe, his heart could thaw. The holidays crept closer, and with them, the garage seemed to pulse with more life than usual. Customers hurried in with frostbitten complaints, batteries that died, and the cold tires that spun helpless on ice. Ben worked long hours, grease staining his hands, but there was a rhythm to it, steady and grounding. What threw off that rhythm wasn't a broken axle or a rusted muffler. It was the sight of Allie pulling up again, not in the Civic this time, but in a black SUV that looked far newer than anything she'd ever mentioned. It idled smoothly in the snow headlights, cutting white arcs through the dusk. Ben's chest tightened. The SUV didn't fit her drifter story. Jacob ran out before Ben could say anything, sliding on the icy patch in his hurry. Allie. She knelt, catching him mid-stumble. Her scarf was crimson tonight, vivid against the snow. Careful, artist. You'll break your drawing hand. Jacob laughed, and the sound was so pure it washed away Ben's unease for a moment. Inside, she set down 2 paper bags, Christmas cookies, and a turkey. I wasn't sure if you'd cooked yet. Ben eyed the bags. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she said simply. Her gaze flicked over Jacob, decorating a cardboard tree cutout, then back to Ben. Besides, holidays shouldn't be survived. They should be shared. The words stirred something bittersweet in him. For years, holidays had been about making do, boxed dinners, small gifts, the two of them pretending that was enough. He never complained, not in front of Jacob, but hearing her say it aloud reminded him of all that was missing. Still, pride itched. We manage. Allie's smile didn't falter. I know. That's why you deserve more. Dinner that night stretched longer than usual. Jacob set the table with unmatched plates humming carols. The turkey roasted in Ben's old oven filled the garage with a warmth that went beyond heat. They ate until Jacob leaned back, groaning. Best Christmas ever, he declared, maple brown eyes drooping. Ben chuckled, carrying him to bed. By the time he returned, Allie was clearing plates, sleeves rolled up. You don't have to do that, Ben said. She glanced up, soap suds dripping from her hands. What makes you think I don't want to? The simple honesty of it unmoored him. He leaned on the counter, watching her hands work, listening to the faint crackle of the radio. For a moment it felt like a life he might have had if things had turned out differently. When the last dish was stacked, Allie dried her hands. Ben, may I ask something? He braced himself. Depends. Why do you always look like you're waiting for the ground to give way? The question cut through him. He looked away, jaw tight. Because it has before. Silence. Then her voice softer. And yet you keep standing. He didn't answer. Couldn't. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. Let someone stand with you. The words rattled his defenses. He felt the urge to tell her everything, the long nights, the debts, the fear that one wrong turn would cost Jacob everything. But vulnerability was a door he hadn't opened in years. So instead he muttered, It's late. Roads'll ice up. Her expression flickered, hurt maybe, but she masked it quickly. Good night, Ben. She left, and the garage felt colder without her. The next day brought confirmation of what Ben had suspected. A customer in town mentioned seeing Allie at the big bank in the city, seated at the head of a boardroom table. She's someone important, the man said. Saw her picture in the paper once, CEO of something. Ben's gut twisted. He remembered the SUV, the quiet authority in her voice, the way she paid without blinking. He replayed every conversation, every smile. Was she laughing at him, testing him? When her Civic pulled up again that evening, back to her disguise, humble and unassuming, Ben wiped his hands on a rag and forced steel into his voice. What game are you playing, Ali? She blinked, genuinely startled. What? Don't lie to me. People talk. You're not just some woman with car trouble. You're more. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy as snow on branches. Then she exhaled, shoulders sagging. You're right, she said quietly. I'm not who I pretended to be. Jacob appeared from the corner, eyes wide. Allie. She looked at him, then back at Ben. Her voice trembled. I should have told you sooner. Ben's heart pounded. The fragile trust they'd built teetered one truth away from collapse. And in that instant, he realized this woman, whoever she was, had already woven herself into Jacob's world, and his own. The air inside the garage thickened with silence, heavier than the winter storm gathering outside. Jacob's eyes flicked between them, searching for answers. Ben tightened his grip on the rag in his hand, the grease smearing darker against his fingers. "Then who are you?" His voice was low-measured, but beneath it burned a raw betrayal. Ali drew a shaky breath. "My name is Alexandra Pierce. I run Pierce Global Holdings. The car, the chilly dinners, the lights, those were real. But she faltered, then steadied herself. I wanted to know what it was like to be seen without my name, without the weight of my company." Ben's jaw flexed. "So you lied." "I hid," she corrected softly. "Because most people don't look at me, Ben. They look at what I can give them." Jacob's voice cracked through the tension. "But you gave us time. Isn't that real?" Ben's chest ached. His boy's words cut straight through his pride. Allie's confession hung like frost in the air. She didn't try to mask the truth anymore. "I know you've got every right to be angry. I should have been honest. But the truth is, I didn't expect to care this much. Not about this garage. Not about—" Her voice broke. "Not about you two." Ben wanted to believe her. A part of him even did. But the image of that SUV, the rumors, her silence, those were thorns he couldn't ignore. "People like you don't stay in places like this," he muttered. "You'll leave. And when you do, it's my kid who gets left behind." The words landed sharper than he intended. Ali's lips parted, pain flickering across her face. She opened her mouth to answer, but Jacob slammed his sketchbook shut, the sound jolting both adults. "Stop fighting," the boy pleaded. "I don't care if she's a queen or a superhero or whatever. She's our friend." Ben's throat tightened. Alexandra crouched to Jacob's level, her eyes glassy. "I'll never stop being your friend," she whispered. The promise felt real, but Ben couldn't trust it. Not yet. The storm outside broke loose that night, snow lashing against the garage, wind howling like something ancient. Alexandra stayed longer than she intended, reluctant to leave them in the thick of an argument. By the dim light of the garage heater, she watched Ben work in silence, his shoulders rigid, every movement precise. Finally, she whispered, "You think I'm playing some game. But do you really believe I'd spend nights here cooking, laughing, helping Jacob with his drawings, if it wasn't real?" Ben didn't look up. "I've seen enough people walk away when things got hard. Doesn't matter what they promised." Her chest tightened. She wanted to reach for him, shake him, make him see. But instead, she stood wrapping her scarf. "I'll go, but I'll be back tomorrow. For Jacob." She left the door closing softly behind her. The next morning, the storm had dumped 2 feet of snow across town. The world glittered white and brittle power lines sagging with ice. Ben bundled Jacob in extra sweaters, ready to trudge to the store for milk when headlights cut through the drifts. Alexandra's SUV again plowing through snow like it was nothing. She stepped out, cheeks pink from the cold arms loaded with groceries. "You're insane," Ben muttered as she stomped inside. Maybe she shot back, breathless. "But I'm also practical. You needed supplies." Jacob cheered already, tearing into a bag of marshmallows. The boy's laughter melted the frost between them faster than any heater could. For a moment, Ben allowed himself to watch her hair damp from snow scarf, tugged loose, smiling despite the weight of unspoken things. Maybe she wasn't lying about all of it. Maybe some part of Alexandra Pierce Billionaire belonged right here in a snow-covered garage with 2 people who had nothing to offer but honesty. That evening, Jacob set up a makeshift movie night, old DVDs, playing on a scratched-up TV. Alexandra curled into the couch beside him, sharing popcorn from a mixing bowl. Ben sat apart at the workbench, tools spread out but untouched. He should have been fixing the alternator in front of him. Instead, he watched them, his son leaning against her shoulder, her hand brushing Jacob's hair absent-mindedly. It was domestic, dangerous, because it felt too right. When the credits rolled and Jacob finally nodded off, Alexandra rose, carefully covering him with a blanket. She turned to Ben, her voice soft. "I know I hurt your trust. I can't undo that. But I'll prove to you this isn't a game. I'll keep showing up." Ben's defenses wavered, but habit kept them high. "Words are easy." Her gaze didn't flinch. "Then I'll show you with actions." And for the first time, Ben found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she meant it. Snowplows carved thin paths through town the next morning, their yellow lights flashing against white drifts. The world outside looked frozen, but inside the garage the heater hummed steady, and for once Ben felt something like calm. He brewed coffee in the dented percolator while Jacob snored softly under his blanket fort in the corner. The calm didn't last. At 8:30, headlights flared outside. Not the SUV, not the Civic this time, a sleek black sedan purred up the drive, so out of place it made Ben's stomach sink. Two men in long coats stepped out, polished shoes, crunching snow. They carried themselves with the kind of confidence that said they didn't bother asking permission anywhere. Alexandra climbed out of the back seat. She wasn't dressed in scarves and sweaters this time. She wore a tailored coat, her posture straight, her eyes sharp. In the cold dawn light, she looked every inch the billionaire people whispered about. Ben felt the truth slam down like a hammer. Then she greeted, her voice softer than her appearance. "May I come in?" The men in coats hovered, but she waved them off, striding toward the garage like she'd done it 100 times. Jacob stirred awake, blinking at her. "Ali." Her gaze softened. "Hey, champ." She crouched, brushing snow from her coat before she touched his shoulder. "I had a meeting in the city, but I needed to see you." Jacob lit up. "You came back." Ben's chest tightened. Of course she came back. But the sight of her flanked by suits stepping out of a chauffeured sedan shattered the fragile illusion they'd been living. He set his coffee down harder than he meant to. "So this is it. The truth." Alexandra straightened her eyes on him now. "Yes. I'm not just Ali. I'm Alexandra Pierce, and I should have told you sooner." The words stirred a storm inside him. He remembered their quiet dinners, the sound of her laugh, mixing with Jacob's, the way she washed dishes like any other guest. Was all of that just an experiment to her? "You played house," Ben said flatly. Her eyes flashed. "No. I lived honestly with you, even if I wasn't honest about my name. Every moment with you and Jacob was real." Jacob's voice broke in, worried. "Dad?" Ben crouched beside his son, steadying him. "It's okay, buddy. We're just figuring things out." But his voice cracked at the edges. Alexandra stepped closer, lowering her tone. "I didn't come here to hurt you. I came here because for once I felt like myself. No shareholders, no boardrooms. Just me. Just Ali." Ben shook his head. "You'll leave. People like you always do." Her jaw trembled. For a moment the CEO veneer cracked. "Maybe I can't promise forever. But I can promise this: I won't walk away without telling you why. And I won't lie to Jacob again." The sincerity in her voice cut through his anger, leaving behind only exhaustion. He wanted to trust her, but the weight of responsibility pressed hard against his ribs. Jacob's trust was fragile, and Ben had sworn to protect it at all costs. Later that day, the garage was busier than usual. Customers came in for tire chains and salt bags, tracking snow across the floor. Alexandra stayed rolling up her sleeves, handing out coffee, even helping an old farmer carry boxes to his truck. The men in coats waited outside, shivering by their sedan, clearly unused to the grit of small-town life. One customer leaned toward Ben, whispering, "Isn't that the Pierce woman? Thought she owned half the city." Ben's stomach twisted. Small towns had long memories, and gossip spread faster than winter fire. By evening, though, Jacob was grinning ear to ear as Alexandra helped him paint a snow-covered barn scene. She laughed when he smeared blue on her cheek, and the sound filled the garage with warmth no storm could match. Watching them, Ben realized something dangerous. He wanted her there. Wanted this life, even if it was built on shaky ground. When Jacob finally drifted to bed, Alexandra lingered at the counter, hands clasped. Her voice was quiet but determined. "I know you don't trust me yet, but give me a chance to earn it." Ben studied her grease-stained hands, folded weariness shadowing his face. He'd spent years keeping people at arm's length, building walls to protect Jacob and himself. But Alexandra's eyes, vulnerable despite her wealth, gnawed at those defenses. "Actions," he said at last. "Words won't do it." She nodded. "Then I'll prove it with actions." And as the wind rattled the windows, Ben realized something unsettling. He believed her. Not fully, not safely, but enough to let her try. The storm had cleared by morning, leaving the town glazed in ice. Sunlight bounced off frozen branches, dazzling but brittle. Ben shoveled the drive while Jacob built a crooked snow fort near the garage doors. Alexandra arrived again, her coat dusted white, balancing a thermos in one hand and a bag of bagels in the other. "You're relentless," Ben muttered as she set the food down on the workbench. Persistent, she corrected unwrapping a bagel and handing it to Jacob. I told you I'll prove this isn't a game. Jacob grinned, crumbs tumbling down his sweater. Ben sighed, but he didn't chase her off. He couldn't, not with the way Jacob's eyes lit whenever she appeared. The days turned into a rhythm. Alexandra stopped by in the morning sometimes with groceries, sometimes just with laughter. She learned how to hold a wrench properly, how to find the right socket, and even how to mop up spilled oil without ruining her shoes. Customers began noticing. Old Mrs. Tucker asked, "That your sister?" A teenager whispered, "She looks like someone from the magazines." Ben brushed the questions off, but the whispers spread. One afternoon, a local reporter snapped photos from across the street. Alexandra ignored it, but Ben's gut twisted. He could handle gossip, but he couldn't shield Jacob from headlines splashed with their names. That night, as the heater rattled in the corner, Ben confronted her. Whatever this is, people are starting to talk. I can't have Jacob caught in that mess." Alexandra's gaze was steady. "Do you regret me being here?" He wanted to say yes to push her away before things grew more dangerous, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. "No, I just don't know if we can afford the fallout." The next day, Alexandra's world crashed through their fragile routine. A black SUV arrived sleeker than hers plates from the city. A man in a charcoal suit stepped out flanked by aides. He walked straight into the garage without asking. "Miss Pierce," he said sharply, ignoring Ben and Jacob. "The board is in uproar. You've missed 2 meetings. Investors are restless. You can't vanish like this." Ben froze, Jacob clutching his sleeve. Alexandra's face tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I told you I'll handle it. Now leave." The man sneered at the grease-stained floors, the patched couch, the boys' drawings taped to the walls. "This is where you've been with them." The insult stung more than Ben expected. He stepped forward, wiping his hands on his rag. "You're in my garage. Watch your tone." The man scoffed, but Alexandra cut him off. "Enough. Go." Her authority cracked like ice underfoot, and the man retreated. But the damage lingered in the silence he left behind. Jacob spoke first, his voice small. "Does that mean you have to leave?" Alexandra crouched, cupping his cheek. "Not if I can help it." Ben wanted to believe her, but reality pressed in. A woman like her belonged to a world of boardrooms and power plays. A man like him belonged under a hood fixing what was broken. That night when Jacob slept, Ben leaned against the workbench, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Your world and mine, they don't mix." Alexandra stood across from him, her coat draped over a chair, hair falling loose. "Maybe they're not supposed to. But I don't care. I want this." He searched her eyes, saw the flicker of truth there. Still doubt gnawed at him. "And when the board forces your hand, when they demand you walk away from us." Her silence said everything. Days later, the board made their move. Headlines splashed across the town's single newspaper, "Pierce heiress missing found in small-town garage." Photos of Alexandra handing Jacob a mug of cocoa ran alongside stories of stock dips and investor panic. Customers whispered louder. Some cheered her for being real. Others muttered she was slumming. For Ben, it was a nightmare. Jacob read over his shoulder, eyes wide. "Dad, are we in trouble?" Ben hugged him close. "No, buddy, we're not the ones in trouble." But when he looked up, Alexandra stood in the doorway, pale, her phone buzzing endlessly in her pocket. And Ben knew the fight for whatever fragile bond they'd built had just begun. The garage felt smaller after the article broke. Customers still came for oil changes and winter tires, but every glance carried questions unspoken. Ben could feel the weight of their stares pressing into his back as he worked beneath hoods. Jacob noticed it too. The boy grew quieter, sketching in the corner instead of chatting with neighbors. Alexandra, however, refused to vanish. She showed up each morning with the same thermos of coffee, the same determination in her eyes. If anything, the storm around her only seemed to harden her resolve. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, some days just jeans, a sweater, and sleeves rolled up to work. Still, the outside world clawed at the edges of their fragile routine. Her phone buzzed endlessly. When she ignored it, the calls turned to visits. One evening, just as Ben was locking up another car, arrived sleek black tinted. Out stepped a woman in a crimson coat, heels crunching in the salted slush. Her expression was sharp enough to cut steel. Alexandra, she said coldly, striding forward. What on earth are you doing here? Ben tensed. Jacob peered from the doorway, sensing the tension. Alexandra froze her jaw tight. Mother, she breathed. The older woman's eyes swept over the garage with disdain. This is your hiding place with grease and filth, and... Her gaze fell on Ben and Jacob. This Ben's hand curled around the wrench in his palm, not as a weapon, but as if holding on to something real, something solid. Alexandra's voice shook, but didn't break. I'm here because I want to be, because this... She gestured at the small garage the boy clinging to his father's sleeve is real. It's not stock prices or board meetings. It's life. Her mother's laugh was brittle. Life. Alexandra, you have responsibilities, a company, thousands of employees. You don't get to play house with mechanics and children. Jacob flinched at the words, his cheeks burning. Ben pulled him closer, his voice low. Easy, son. Words can't touch us unless we let them. But inside, fury burned. He'd worked too hard to protect Jacob from that kind of cruelty. Alexandra stepped closer to her mother, her eyes blazing. This isn't a game. Jacob is a child, not collateral. And Ben is more of a man than anyone sitting at that board table. The older woman stiffened, shocked by the defiance. You'd risk everything for them. Without hesitation, Alexandra answered, Yes. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Her mother's eyes narrowed, but she turned sharply, marching back to the car. The door slammed, tires hissed on ice, and then she was gone. The garage was quiet again, only the hum of the heater filling the air. Jacob looked up at Alexandra, his eyes wide. She doesn't like us. Alexandra knelt, pulling him into a hug. She doesn't know you yet. That's her loss. Ben watched, torn between gratitude and unease. Alexandra had chosen them, at least for now. But her mother's words echoed in his mind. You don't get to play house. Later, after Jacob was tucked in, Ben lingered by the workbench, wiping his hands on a rag already clean. Alexandra stood across from him, her face pale in the dim light. You didn't have to defend us like that, he said quietly. Yes, I did, she replied, her voice trembling now that the moment had passed, because you and Jacob are the only things that feel right in my life. Ben looked at her for a long time, the walls around his heart creaking under the weight of her honesty. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to let her in, but he also knew storms like hers didn't pass easily. The next morning, the whispers in town grew louder. Some customers muttered under their breath. Others offered awkward support. One man shook Ben's hand, saying, Heard you stood up to the Pierces? Good for you. Another warned, They don't lose. Be careful. Through it all, Alexandra stayed shoulders squared, chin lifted. She no longer pretended to be Allie. She was Alexandra Pierce Billionaire's daughter, CEO under fire, and yet she was also the woman who brewed coffee in Ben's battered percolator, who laughed at Jacob's jokes, who knelt on cold concrete to scrub oil stains from the floor. And for the first time, Ben wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could belong to both worlds. Winter hung on longer than it should have, a stubborn guest who didn't understand the hint. The snow receded from lawns but clung to the edges of sidewalks, a crust of old ice that wouldn't melt. Newsstands still had the paper with the photo, Alexandra handing Jacob a mug. Ben's name misspelled under the caption, as if that might lessen the heat of being seen. People folded those papers under their arms like gossip they could take home. At the garage, business did not stop. It shifted. Some customers arrived with awkward smiles and cash tips too large, as if generosity might buy front-row seats to the unfolding spectacle. Others came in with thinly veiled contempt, asking whether the heiress would be the one changing their oil today. Ben learned the art of not flinching. He kept his eyes on bolts and belts, the work that had always told the truth. Jacob learned something different. He hunched closer over his sketchbook shoulders, creeping toward his ears. He didn't complain, but Ben noticed how the boy's drawings returned to winter, even when the calendar insistently edged toward spring. Bare trees, cold skies, a sun trying and failing to burn through gray. One afternoon, his art teacher called. Mr. Carter, could you come by after school? Jacob's fine, nothing urgent. I just think he's caring more than he says. Ben walked to the school, hands jammed into his jacket pockets. The hallways echoed with sneakers and laughter walls plastered with construction paper tulips. In the quiet of the art room, Mrs. Chandler pointed at Jacob's latest work, A Family Beneath a Tree, the woman's face half-sketched, left purposely unfinished. "He's extraordinarily gifted," she said low. "But he's drawing erasure. I'm not a psychologist, Mr. Carter, but kids have a way of telling the truth on paper." On the walk home, Ben asked Jacob about it. The boy shrugged. "It's not a sad thing," he said, quick to reassure. "It's just, life keeps changing. I'm trying to keep up." Ben swallowed. He wanted to say that life didn't have to change again, that they could choose quiet over chaos. But the street corner was already crowded with whispers. A pickup rolled past too slowly. A stranger snapped a photo through fogged glass and sped away. Jacob noticed. Of course he noticed. That night after Jacob fell asleep with a pencil resting in his fingers. Ben stood at the kitchen sink and stared into dark glass. He saw his reflection layered with the faint ghost of the garage behind him, the tool pegboard, the old radio strings of Christmas lights that had somehow never come down. He remembered Alexandra standing where he stood now, sleeves rolled up, laughing over soapy plates. The memory hurt and healed in the same breath. He called her. She arrived 10 minutes later, breathless from the short drive, hair pulled into a loose knot, as if she'd left mid-meeting. She took one look at his face and didn't ask what was wrong. She moved closer like she'd always belonged in that space and set her hand on the counter close, but not touching his. "I need to leave," Ben said. The words hung between them, and even the heater seemed to pause the room, waiting for the rest. For a few weeks, she asked carefully. Hope tried to thread itself through her voice. "I can handle the board. The press will move on. We can know." He forced the truth out clean, for good. Her breath hitched. She covered it with a small nod that broke his heart more than tears would have. "Because of me. Because of all this." He gestured vaguely at the world, the headlines, the whispers, the black sedans that came and went like crows. "I can't ask an 8-year-old to shoulder the weight of a story he never asked to be in." "Ben, I can fix." He shook his head. "You can fix stock prices. You can outmaneuver a board. You can't build a life for us in a town that's decided we're entertainment." The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It contained all the meals they'd shared, all the laughter that had come back to the garage because of her. Alexandra stared at the floor, blinking hard. When she finally looked up, the rawness in her gaze was exactly the thing that had undone him from the start. When she asked, "Soon as I can pack." She nodded again, slower this time. "Let me help." He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say no. He wanted to ask her to come with them, and hated himself for wanting what he couldn't offer Jacob without ripping up the little security he'd rebuilt. In the end, he said the only thing that felt honest. "I don't know if that makes this easier or harder." Alexandra swallowed the muscles in her throat, working like a woman learning how to breathe underwater. "Then I'll stay out of the way. But I'm not disappearing." She steadied herself on the counter, voice firming. "I won't disappear." He wanted to believe her. He would have given anything to. They packed in 2 days. Ben called regulars, rescheduled what he could, and returned the rest with apologies he hoped sounded like respect. He loaded essentials into the Ford tool chest, the coffee mug Linda had loved Jacob's drawings, layered flat as petals, clothes rolled tight into plastic bins. He taped boxes while Jacob labeled them in block letters. Books, tools, art kitchen. The smallness of the handwriting bruised Ben's chest. Mrs. Patterson shuffled over with a casserole lasagna because grief needed layers and tears, like small bright stones in her eyes. "Maple Street won't be the same," she said, patting Ben's sleeve with both hands. "We'll send an address," Ben promised. "Don't you dare not," she bent to hug Jacob. "You draw me a postcard, you hear, I will," he said into her cardigan voice, muffled. Alexandra kept her distance like she'd promised. Ben knew she sat in her SUV at the far end of the street for hours the night before they left. He saw the shape of her there when he went out to the curb with one last bag of trash. She didn't get out. He didn't wave. The restraint felt like a small, necessary cruelty. On the morning they pulled away, the truck idled at the curb, exhaust ghosting in the cold. Ben checked straps twice. Jacob slid into the passenger seat and hugged the sketchbook to his chest. He had tucked a single pencil into the spiral, the old wooden one that had been his mother's teeth marks, worn smooth. "Ready?" Ben asked. Jacob nodded. Then unexpectedly, he said, "Can I say goodbye to her?" Ben's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't ask who. He knew. He turned the truck off. Alexandra was already walking up the street as if the boy's voice had drawn her from the horizon. No makeup, hair pulled into a wool cap. The rich woman and the small-town garage both stripped from her frame so that all that remained was a person who loved someone she had no right to claim. She crouched by the passenger door, keeping the cold out with her body. "I brought you something," she said, and held up a small portfolio wrapped in canvas. "It's just a book. Blank pages. For the drawings you're going to make in the new place." Jacob took it like an offering from a myth. He didn't open it. He simply pressed it to his heart. "Thank you, Ali." "Alexandra," she corrected gently. "But you can call me anything you like." He frowned, chewing on the edges of a brave thought. "Will you find us? Not now, but later." Her answer came without hesitation. "Yes." Then softer. "Only if your dad says it's okay." Jacob looked at Ben. Ben looked at both of them and imagined the next month the quiet apartment somewhere far away. The way he'd missed the sound of her laugh, bouncing off cinder block, the ease with which she had stepped into the spaces of their days. He thought of the headlines, the men in suits, the mother with the red coat and the sharp tongue. He thought of Jacob's drawings, half light and half shadow, waiting for him to make a choice that would color them one way or the other. "Give us time," he said. "Then we'll call." Alexandra nodded like a vow. She reached through the open window and touched Jacob's cheek with the back of her fingers. Then she stepped back, hands stuffed deep in her pockets to keep from reaching again. Ben turned the key. The engine coughed, caught steadied. He shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb he'd parked at 1,000 times. In the side mirror, Alexandra grew smaller, then blurred, then became only the suggestion of a person standing where a chapter ended. They drove until the town gave way to highway, and the highway to a city that didn't know their names. The new place was a second-floor walk-up above a deli that smelled of yeast and oregano, even at dawn. The apartment had 2 small bedrooms and linoleum that curled at the corners. The radiator hissed like an animal, and the view was a brick wall painted with a mural of birds in flight. Ben set the tool chest in the corner, the coffee mug on the windowsill, and the lasagna in the fridge. Jacob claimed the bedroom with the fire escape and arranged his pencils in a row on the windowsill, like soldiers ready to march into a blank day. They ate deli sandwiches on the floor, knees touching a cardboard box marked kitchen. When the city's lights came on, Jacob drew them dashes and dots in the air and smiled at Ben with a tiredness that wasn't quite sad. "It feels different," Jacob said. "Different can be good," Ben answered. He meant it and didn't. Then he added, "We'll make it good." He unpacked the last box alone after Jacob fell asleep. In the bottom beneath dish towels and the last of the plates, he found a small envelope tucked where it hadn't been before. No stamp, just his name written in Alexandra's hand. He didn't open it, not yet. He slid it into the drawer with the silverware and told himself he was saving it for a day when hope felt less like a risk. Outside horns bled into a lullaby. Somewhere below, a drunk laughed. The radiator clicked its endless song. Ben lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and told himself he'd made the right choice, the only choice, the one that made the world smaller and therefore safer. He believed himself for almost 5 minutes. And then in the quiet that came after he admitted what he hadn't said aloud, he had cut them free because he loved them too much to let the world devour them. He had cut himself free because he didn't trust his heart not to make promises it might not be able to keep. In the next room, a boy slept with a pencil in his hand, ready to draw light in a place that had never seen it from him before. Somewhere else, a woman stood in a driveway she had no right to claim as hers and practiced not turning back. They were not done with one another. The story hadn't ended. It had pulled tight like a knot tied to keep something from fraying. Morning would arrive, bills would be paid, new names would learn theirs, and somewhere just beyond the curve of what they could see, something would break again, not in a way that destroyed, but in the way that forced a heart to open. The city took them in the way it always did, indifferently. For Ben, that was a relief. Nobody knew his name. Nobody cared about a newspaper photo. Nobody whispered at the sound of his boots against concrete. Here he was just another man renting too much space for too little money, hauling groceries up narrow stairs, chasing work in garages where foremen sized him up in a glance. For Jacob, the adjustment was slower. His new school had fluorescent lights that hummed too loud, teachers who mispronounced his last name, and kids who cared more about sneakers than sketchbooks. He ate his lunch at the edge of the cafeteria and drew city skylines with sharp angles, his pencil scratching like a creature trying to climb out of paper. Ben worried, but tried not to press. At night after Jacob was asleep, he studied want ads calling shops until his voice rasped. He landed work in a repair shop on the outskirts, less pay longer commute, but honest. The kind of place where the air smelled of burnt oil and the boss didn't ask about your past if you showed up on time and didn't complain about grease under your nails. One evening, after a long shift, Ben came home to find Jacob sitting cross-legged on the fire escape sketchbook balanced on his knees. The city stretched behind him in neon smears and shadow. "Careful there," Ben said softly, easing the window open. "I like it out here," Jacob murmured, not looking up. "It's loud, but it makes me feel awake." Ben stepped onto the metal grating, the night air sharp with fried food and car exhaust. Drawing the skyline, Jacob shook his head. He turned the page toward his father. It wasn't buildings, it was Alexandra. The lines were loose but alive. Her face tilted in laughter, eyes, crinkled hair, pulled loose from its perfect bun. Ben's chest tightened. That from memory. "Yeah," Jacob said. He hesitated, then added, "I think she misses us." The boy's voice was steady, but Ben heard the plea inside it. He didn't answer right away. The city carried sirens and music past them, as if mocking the silence he was holding. Finally, he said, "Missing someone and being able to be with them aren't always the same thing." Jacob's pencil paused. "But maybe they can be—" Ben didn't know what to do with hope spoken that simply. He ruffled the boy's hair and forced a small smile. "Come on, bedtime." But when Jacob finally slept, Ben sat in the kitchen staring at the unopened envelope tucked in the drawer. He hadn't touched it in weeks. His hand drifted toward it, stopped, then retreated. He wasn't ready, not yet. Meanwhile, in the town they'd left behind, Alexandra was drowning in silence of her own. The board meetings blurred together, shareholders clamored about market dips, and headlines dissected her clothes more than her strategies. She played her role with surgical precision, but when the day ended and the penthouse emptied, she was left with absence. Her assistant once found her standing by the window at dawn, barefoot, coffee gone cold. "You're supposed to be at the office in 30, the assistant whispered, as if afraid to break her. "I know," Alexandra said, but her gaze stayed pinned to the street below, as if willing a certain truck to reappear. She wrote letters she never sent. She told herself they deserved space-time. She reminded herself of the promise she had made. "Give us time. Then we'll call." But night stretched and no call came. One Friday, she slipped into her car without telling her driver where to go. She wound up at the garage, the bay door shut, the radio inside silent. She pressed her palm to the cold metal and whispered his name once like a prayer swallowed by air. Then she turned and walked away before the ache could split her open. Back in the city, Jacob finally cracked first. At breakfast, spoon clinking against a bowl of cereal that had gone soggy, he blurted, "I think we should tell her where we are." Ben froze mid-sip of his coffee. "Jake." "She's alone," the boy pressed. "And so are we." "You think I don't know? I draw it every night." The space, the missing part. Ben set the mug down hard enough to make it slosh. He dragged a hand over his face. "I'm trying to keep you safe." Jacob's voice softened, but it cut sharper. Safe isn't the same as happy dad. The silence stretched until Jacob shoved his chair back and stomped to his room. The door clicked shut. Ben sat there, staring at the envelope in the drawer. His hand finally moved. He pulled it out, tore it open. Inside was a single page. "Ben, you don't have to answer. I just need you to know leaving doesn't erase you. I carry you and Jacob in ways I can't put down. If the day ever comes when space isn't what you need, I will be here. Not as a CEO, not as a name in a paper, just as someone who was given a chance to belong and will never forget it." Ben folded the letter, hands trembling. For the first time in weeks, he let himself say it aloud, a whisper no one could hear. I miss you too. The city outside didn't care, but somewhere across distance and silence he prayed she felt it. The winter-deepened gray skies pressing heavy over the city. Ben moved like a man stitched together by willpower alone. Early mornings, long shifts, late nights spent fixing what the shop couldn't bill for just to keep his hands from trembling with the weight of choices unmade. Jacob carried his sketchbook everywhere, filling page after page with outlines of people who weren't there. Alexandra laughing, Alexandra leaning against the counter, Alexandra kneeling to tie his shoelace. It became a ritual. Ben would find the sketches tucked beneath his pillow, slipped into his coat pocket, taped to the refrigerator. Jacob didn't say the words out loud anymore, but the drawings screamed them, "Bring her back." One raw February morning, a letter came addressed not to Ben, but to Jacob. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and instantly recognizable. Ben hesitated, turning it over in his hands. "Who's it from?" Jacob asked, stepping into the kitchen with hair still messy from sleep. Ben considered lying, but Jacob's eyes were too old for his age. He handed it over. Jacob tore it open and read silently, lips moving. His face softened, then brightened in a way Ben hadn't seen since they left town. He passed the letter across the table. Jacob, I don't know what to say except that I think of you every single day. I imagine what you're drawing, what stories you've invented, what questions you'd ask me if you were here. I'm proud of you even from far away. Someday soon, I hope I can tell you that face to face. Until then, remember, your art has a way of keeping people close even when they're far. It's keeping me close to you now. Always, Alexandra. Ben folded the page slowly. His throat ached. Jacob's gaze pinned him, daring him to dismiss it. Dad, the boy whispered. She didn't forget us. Ben rubbed his temples. That doesn't mean what? That she can't be here, or that you won't let her? The accusation hung between them. For the first time, Ben didn't know how to answer. Across the miles, Alexandra faced storms of her own. The board had quieted partly because profits had stabilized, partly because the story had shifted to other scandals. But her heart was restless. Each night she reread Jacob's last drawing, the one he had slipped into her handbag before disappearing a family of 3, hand in hand, standing beneath a crooked tree. She traced the lines until the paper softened under her fingertips. She knew the risk of reaching out again. Her mother's warning echoed in her ears. You can't belong in both worlds. But Alexandra wasn't sure she wanted to belong to her mother's world anymore. So she wrote. Letter after letter, none sent until finally she couldn't bear it. She booked a quiet flight, no assistance, no press, no security detail, just herself. A woman following a thread she couldn't cut. The knock on the apartment door came on a Saturday morning. Ben had just set a skillet of eggs on the stove when Jacob froze pencil mid-line. The knock came again, gentle but certain. Ben's pulse thudded. He motioned for Jacob to stay back and opened the door. There she was. No driver, no designer coat. Just a woman in a gray sweater, hair pulled back, suitcase in hand. Hi, Alexandra, said softly. Ben's breath caught. For a moment he couldn't move. Then Jacob darted past him, flinging himself into her arms. She laughed through tears, holding him as if she'd never let go again. Ben stood frozen in the doorway, the skillet hissing behind him. He should tell her to leave. He should close the door, protect the fragile balance they had found. But when Alexandra finally looked up, eyes shining, she whispered, I couldn't stay away. And the walls Ben had built around himself began to crack. They sat at the kitchen table, eggs forgotten. Jacob chattering non-stop. He showed her drawings, each one a piece of the time they'd spent apart. Alexandra listened as if each page were scripture, her fingers brushing Jacob's hair every few seconds, as if to prove he was real. Ben leaned against the counter, arms crossed, heart a storm. Finally, Alexandra met his eyes. I know I don't deserve this, she said quietly, but I needed to see you both. Just once, if that's all you'll allow. Ben's jaw tightened. And when you leave again? What then? Her voice wavered but held steady. Then at least you'll know I came back, that I wasn't just a story in a paper, that I meant what I said. The silence stretched taut as wire. Jacob broke it with a simple plea. Dad, don't make her go. Ben closed his eyes, fighting against hope, against fear, against the truth Jacob had drawn 100 times already. When he opened them again, Alexandra was still there, waiting. Not demanding, just waiting. And for the first time he thought maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let her in. Morning arrived hesitant, as if the sun were peeking over the brick wall outside the kitchen window to check whether it was allowed in. Alexandra stood by the stove where Ben had abandoned those eggs yesterday. Sleeves pushed to her elbows, flipping them carefully like a student eager for extra credit. The apartment smelled of butter and toast and the oregano drift that rose from the deli vents below. Jacob sat on a chair with his legs tucked underneath the canvas-wrapped portfolio she'd brought laid across his lap, like a small animal he didn't want to startle. "Can I open it now?" he asked, eyes bright with a hope Ben hadn't seen since they left Millbrook. "Open it," Alexandra said, smiling without the high polish of her boardroom version. He untied the string, lifted the cover. Inside were thick blank sheets, a softness to the tooth he recognized from the good paper she used to smuggle into the garage. He ran his palm across the first page, reverent. "It sounds like snow," he said, "when you rub it, like quiet." "It's yours," Alexandra said. "All of it." She slid a small tin toward him. Charcoal, kneadable eraser, a few graphite sticks. Ben poured coffee and watched her jaw tight with something that wasn't quite suspicion anymore. He cleared his throat. "Ground rules," he said finally. "We keep Jacob out of the papers. You come here as yourself, no suits of armor, no entourage. And you tell him the truth even when it's messy." "Yes," Alexandra said too quickly to be negotiating. "I can do that." Jacob glanced between them, weighing adult words with a child's seriousness. "Can we go somewhere?" he asked. "Not far, just out." Alexandra hesitated, looking to Ben. He held her gaze for a beat, then nodded. "There's a park 2 blocks east," he said. "A little pond that tries hard to be pretty." The city felt colder after days of gray. They walked in a row, Ben with his hands in his pockets, Alexandra with her scarf wrapped twice around her throat, Jacob clutching the portfolio like a shield. The pond wore a skin of ice thin as candy gulls pacing like critics. A man sold roasted chestnuts from a cart, the air braided sweetness with salt and the metallic bite of winter. Jacob sat on a bench and opened to the first page. He looked up, eyes narrowing at the way light split on ice. He began to draw with a new carefulness, mark, pause, inhale mark. Alexandra didn't correct him, only watched, nodding in time with his strokes. "You see it," she murmured. "I think so," he said, cheeks pinked by cold. "The way it's bright and not bright." Ben tried to stand back from the quiet miracle happening on that bench, tried to let it happen without naming it. The city bustled past, indifferent, and for a minute he was grateful for indifference. It let them be a small world inside a larger one. When Jacob coughed, it didn't register as anything but winter. When he coughed again, sharp, persistent, Ben turned. "You okay, champ?" Jacob nodded, stubborn, and bent to the page. The pencil trembled. He coughed harder this time, a sound that reached down his chest and seemed to pull him inside out. The tinny color fled his face. "Hey," Ben said, stepping forward. "Take a second." "I'm fine," Jacob said, still trying to draw. "It's just—" His words blurred. The pencil slipped from his fingers and clattered on the pavement. He swayed. Alexandra was already on her feet. "Ben." "I've got you," Ben said, catching his son under the arms as the boy crumpled. Jacob's weight was frighteningly light, the bones of his shoulders like bird wings beneath his jacket. "Call Alexandra," said, voice steady, the way a horizon is steady. She was already punching 911. "We're at Tompkins and 6th, the north side of the pond." Child 8 collapsed, breathing but shallow. "Yes." Ben crouched on the cold concrete, cradling his boy, his own breath coming in shallow knives. Jacob's eyes fluttered open, closed, opened again like someone stuck between 2 rooms and unsure which one he belonged in. "Hey, hey," Ben murmured. "Look at me." "You're okay." Alexandra stripped off her scarf and tucked it beneath Jacob's head. She pressed the back of her fingers to his cheek, then his throat, counting something only she could hear. Her jaw flexed once. "They're 3 minutes out," she said. "He's breathing." "Ben, look at me." "He's breathing." Those 3 minutes stretched so thin Ben could see through them. He heard everything: gulls swearing, the chestnut man muttering a prayer in a language Ben didn't know, the far-off wail growing nearer. He cataloged stupid details so he wouldn't catalog his fear. Ice cracking toward the center of the pond, a red mitten dropped by some other child, the way Jacob's pencil had rolled against his boot and stopped. The ambulance burst the world apart again, all red and white and certainty. EMTs knelt, spoke in quick shorthand. History. Cough syncope child, 8. Pulse ox, 88. The numbers were a foreign country. Ben followed their instructions, moved when they asked, let go when they took his son from his arms. He climbed into the ambulance without asking permission. Alexandra followed, her hands folded tight in her lap, as if she were holding the rest of her body together with her fingers. Hospitals smell like lemon and fear. The doors shuttered closed behind them, and the machine language took over triage pediatric cardiology consult. A nurse clipped a sensor to Jacob's finger. The monitor responded with a jittering green heartbeat that looked too small to be a heart. Mr. Carter. A doctor in blue scrubs appeared, eyes kind but clinical. I'm Dr. Ramos. We're seeing signs consistent with a congenital heart defect, likely valve-related. Has Jacob ever had episodes of dizziness, palpitations, fatigue? Ben swallowed 1,000 moments that fit all too well. He gets tired. Sometimes he says his chest feels tight when he runs. The words tasted like guilt. It's not something you could have known, Ramos said, as if reading his mind. These things can lurk until a growth spurt or stress triggers symptoms. He glanced at Alexandra, then back to Ben. We'll need an echocardiogram. If the imaging confirms what we suspect, surgery will be recommended sooner rather than later. Surgery. Ben repeated the word, falling through him. Ramos nodded. We do this every day. The prognosis is good, but we should move quickly. When the doctor left the room, shrank to its beeps and the sound of Jacob's small breath. Ben stood with his palm on the bed rail because he needed to touch something solid. Alexandra stood close enough that the wool of her sweater brushed his knuckles. I can, she started. Donnie said, reflex snapping up like a shield. Not yet, she closed her mouth. The silence that followed wasn't offended. It was careful. A woman with a clipboard appeared, as if conjured. Mr. Carter, I'm Financial Services. We've verified your insurance. I'm afraid your plan is limited on surgical coverage for pediatric cardiology. We'll do everything we can to work out. She slid a printout toward him. Numbers marched across the page like an invading army. Ben stared until they blurred. He did the terrible math of years and wages and the value of a life you can't put into a spreadsheet. He felt his pride try to stand up and then fall over, useless. Alexandra's voice remained low, steady. May I speak with admissions? The financial officer glanced at her, then at Ben. Ben's jaw locked. The room pivoted on his choice. He looked at the printout again, at his boy on the bed, at a monitor translating heartbeats into green light. He nodded once. Alexandra stepped into the hall and became something else, not the ice-cold executive of headlines, but a version of herself that made things happen because a child's life was on the scale. She spoke gently, then firmly. She asked for a supervisor. She requested the hospital's foundation liaison. Yes, I can fund it anonymously. No, not as a publicity initiative. I said anonymous. When she returned, her hands were shaking now that the momentum had nowhere to go. It's handled, she said softly. The hospital's foundation will cover the surgery and aftercare. No headlines, no debt. No one outside this building needs to know. Ben's throat worked. Pride staged one last pitiful protest on the steps of his heart and disappeared under the weight of love. Why, he asked and hated how small the word sounded. Because he is your son, she said, as if that ended the argument. Then more quietly. Because you carried me out of a car without asking my name. Because you taught me that goodness can exist without cost. Let me answer the world in your language for once. He didn't have words big enough for that. He reached out barely, and she took his hand as if it had always been hers to hold. Dr. Ramos returned with the echo results, images like moonscapes frozen in black and white. Bicuspid aortic valve with stenosis, he said. It explains everything. We're recommending surgical repair in the morning. Tomorrow, Ben repeated. We'll take good care of him, Ramos said. He met Ben's eyes until Ben had to look away for fear he'd see his own terror reflected back. I promise. Night widened around them. Hospitals don't have proper night. The fluorescence dim just enough to make everything feel like the inside of a dream you can't wake from. Ben sat in the hard chair beside Jacob's bed. Alexandra fetched bad coffee, then better tea, then a blanket, because Ben refused to move and the air kept needling his back. At 2 a.m., Jacob stirred. "Dad." "I'm here," Ben said, standing so fast his knee cracked. Ali Jacob's voice was a thread. Alexandra leaned in. "I'm here too. Can you draw with me tomorrow?" he asked. Lids heavy. "Tomorrow," she said. Even though tomorrow he'd be in an operating room and she'd be praying in a hallway. "I'll bring the good paper." His lashes settled. The monitor traced his small mountain range. Silence pulled its chair between them and settled in. Around 4, a janitor with headphones walked the halls, mop whispering secrets to tile. In another room, a baby wailed and was comforted. The world continued unfair and ordinary. At dawn, the surgical team came with soft voices and efficient hands. They explained what would happen, as if explaining a recipe, then wheeled Jacob toward double doors that made Ben think of other doors, the kind that close and don't open the same way again. Ben walked beside the gurney until the red line on the floor said, "Family waits here." He pressed his cheek to his son's hair, breathed in the shampoo and the medicinal overlay. "You're strong," he said into that hair. "Stronger than me." Jacob's eyes opened one last time. "Draw the light." He whispered their code for hope. "We will," Ben said, and stepped back. The doors swung closed with a hush that felt louder than a slam. Ben stood there, sudden and useless as a statue. Alexandra didn't talk. She didn't promise. She simply reached for his hand again, and he let her take it. They turned together and walked to the waiting room. Two figures stitched side by a thread they hadn't chosen but wouldn't cut. On the table sat a cheap pen and a stack of forms. Alexandra pulled one of Jacob's graphite sticks from the portfolio she'd insisted on carrying and set it between them. "Actions, not words," she said, half to herself. Ben nodded, knuckles, white eyes on the double doors that held his whole world. Then we wait. The clock began to count in honest seconds. Outside, the city climbed into day. Inside, under lights that pretended to be sun, a boy's brave heart met a stranger's hands. And in the corridor beyond, a man and a woman, too proud, too wounded, too in love with someone small to pretend otherwise, faced the only thing harder than lost hope. The waiting room was a theater of dread. Beige walls, plastic chairs bolted in rows, a coffee machine that gurgled but never seemed to finish brewing. Ben sat forward, elbows on knees, staring at the same tile pattern until it burned into his eyes. Alexandra sat beside him. Posture-perfect hands interlocked so tightly, her knuckles shone white. Neither spoke. Hours had the weight of mountains. A clock on the wall ticked too loudly, its hands crawling across a face that mocked their desperation. Occasionally, the double doors swung open with a nurse or orderly, but never with the words they needed. Ben muttered, "They said 4 hours." "It hasn't been 4, Alexandra replied softly, though she knew it had been nearly 3.5. Her tone was less correction and more plea. He rubbed his face. "What if—" "Don't," she said sharply, cutting him off. "You taught me not to play out the worst before it comes. Remember?" That silenced him, but his leg kept bouncing, knee hammering the floor like a drum. Alexandra reached over, resting her hand on his. He didn't move away this time. Across the room, a mother cradled a newborn, whispering lullabies in Spanish. An old man dozed, mouth open, a folded newspaper sliding from his lap. Life in fragments colliding with their vigil. Ben whispered, "He asked me to draw the light." Alexandra tilted her head, eyes glassy. "Then let's draw it." She pulled Jacob's portfolio from her bag, laid it open on her lap. The blank page yawned at them, demanding something more than panic. She offered him the graphite stick. He hesitated. His calloused fingers brushed hers as he took it. Slowly, awkwardly, he sketched. A line, then another. A curve, a shadow. His hand trembled but steadied with each stroke. Alexandra leaned close, adding her own marks with quick precision. Together they drew a window opening onto a rising sun rays spilling outward like promises. When they finished, the crude sketch looked like hope refusing to be small. Ben stared at it. He'll want to see this. He will, Alexandra said, her certainty more a prayer than knowledge. Hours later, the double doors finally opened. Dr. Ramos appeared, surgical cap still on mask, tugged beneath his chin. His eyes sought theirs across the waiting room. Ben was on his feet before the doctor spoke. The surgery was successful, Ramos said. We repaired the valve. Jacob's heart is strong. He's stable. Ben's knees nearly buckled with relief. Alexandra pressed both hands to her mouth, shoulders shaking once before she composed herself. Can we see him? Ben asked. Briefly, yes, Ramos said. He's sedated, but you can be there when he wakes. They followed down corridors that seemed lighter now, past doors and machines, until they entered a recovery room humming with steady beeps. Jacob lay small against a sea of white sheets, chest rising and falling beneath tubes and sensors. His hair was damp with sweat, his lips pale, but not lifeless. Ben sat beside him, gripping the boy's hand gently, terrified to squeeze too hard. I'm here, champ. We made it. Alexandra stood near the foot of the bed, fingers twisting her scarf. She whispered, draw the light, as if the words themselves could anchor him back to them. Jacob stirred, faintly, eyelids fluttering. A murmur escaped his lips. Ben leaned close. It's okay, Jacob. Rest. You're safe. The boy's eyes opened a crack, glazed with anesthesia. Dad? Yes. Ali. I'm right here, Alexandra said, stepping closer. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Good. He slipped back into sleep. Ben exhaled, pressing his forehead to the mattress. Alexandra reached out and for the first time placed her hand gently on his back. He didn't push her away. The days that followed blurred into routine, nurses adjusting IVs, doctors explaining progress, Jacob slowly regaining color. Each improvement was a victory celebrated with quiet tears and soft laughter. On the third morning, Jacob was awake enough to talk. His voice was weak, but his eyes burned with the same determination he always had when drawing. Dad? He whispered, did you draw it? Ben pulled the sketch from the portfolio, edges smudged. He unfolded it and placed it on Jacob's lap. Jacob studied it, running a fingertip across the rays. His smile widened. You did it. You drew the light. His eyes shifted to Alexandra. Did you draw too? Yes, she said, her voice catching. I helped, he nodded, satisfied. Then it's ours. Ben swallowed hard, the weight of pride and love threatening to undo him. Yeah, champ, it's ours. Outside Jacob's room that evening, Ben and Alexandra finally faced each other without the buffer of crisis. You saved him, Ben said, voice low. Her eyes softened. No. You did. You're the reason he's strong enough to fight. You paid for the surgery, he countered. She shook her head. Money doesn't hold his hand at night. Money doesn't teach him to see light where others see shadows. That's you. For once he didn't argue. The truth sat too heavily to deny, but he also saw something else in her eyes, a longing not just for Jacob's healing, but for something bigger, something binding the three of them together. And it scared him. Because as much as she'd proven herself, as much as he couldn't deny her place in their lives, Ben still carried the instinct to run when things felt too fragile to hold. He whispered more to himself than to her. Don't make promises you can't keep. Alexandra's reply was soft, steady. I'm not the one breaking anymore, Ben. Inside the room, Jacob slept peacefully, chest rising with the rhythm of a mended heart. Outside, his father and the woman who had become part of their story stood on the edge of something that could heal them both or shatter them again. Spring returned to the city with a stubborn kind of grace trees pushing green despite soot-stained streets, rain-washing winter's grit into drains. For the first time in months, Ben let himself notice the season. He wheeled Jacob out of the hospital under skies streaked with pale blue. The boy sat bundled in a blanket sketchbook balanced on his lap, his smile tired but wide. Alexandra walked a step behind them carrying a bag of medications and discharge papers. She looked like she belonged there, as natural as the blooming magnolias lining the hospital entrance. And though Ben didn't say it aloud, he didn't mind her being part of that picture. At home, life adjusted slowly. The beeping machines of the hospital were replaced by the soft hum of their apartment fridge, the scratch of pencil against paper, the smell of soup simmering on the stove. Ben fussed endlessly, measuring Jacob's medicine twice, fluffing pillows, checking the boy's breathing at night until Jacob groaned, "Dad, stop staring at me like I'm going to vanish." "I almost lost you," Ben muttered, once voice breaking. "But you didn't." Jacob answered matter-of-fact with a resilience that made him seem older than his years. Alexandra visited daily. She'd bring groceries, art supplies, or simply herself, her presence filling corners of the apartment once hollow. She listened to Jacob's stories, joined in his sketches, laughed at his terrible jokes. But always she left before nightfall. One evening, Ben walked her down to the street. The glow of street lamps painted her face in gold. She shifted the strap of her purse, then hesitated. "Ben," she began, "I don't want to keep intruding, but Jacob, he makes me feel like I've found something I didn't know I was missing, and I don't want to lose that." He studied her wary. "And what about when the board calls you back? When the press decides you shouldn't be here?" She held his gaze. "Then I'll answer them. But I won't leave Jacob, or you, not this time." Her words sank into him, uncomfortable and undeniable. He wanted to believe. More than that, he was terrified of what believing would cost if she broke it. Weeks passed. Jacob grew stronger. He returned to school part-time, sketching every teacher before they even noticed. One afternoon, he burst through the apartment door with paper fluttering in his hands. "Dad, Ali, look." Ben glanced up from the sink. Alexandra, seated at the table, turned eagerly. Jacob unfolded the paper, a sketch of 3 figures standing beneath the crooked tree he always drew. But this time the figures weren't vague. The man had Ben's broad shoulders. The woman's hair was pulled back like Alexandra's. The boy in the middle clutched both their hands. Beneath the drawing, in Jacob's uneven scrawl, were the words, "My family." Ben froze. Alexandra's eyes flooded. Jacob grinned, holding the paper high like a flag. "It's us. It's always been us." For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the muffled sounds of life outside all faded. Only the truth of that drawing filled the room. Ben swallowed hard. "Jacob—" "Don't say it's just a drawing," Jacob interrupted fierce. "It's real. You two just have to admit it." Ben looked at Alexandra. She didn't speak, didn't push. She only weighted her hands, trembling slightly on the table. Later that night, after Jacob fell asleep, Ben sat alone on the balcony. The city stretched beneath him, lights flickering like restless stars. Alexandra stepped out quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Jacob's right," she said softly. Ben exhaled smoke from a cigarette he hadn't lit, just holding it between his fingers, a habit from a past he thought he'd buried. He turned it over before answering. "Believing in this scares me more than anything." "Because it's fragile," she asked. "Because it's real," he said. "And if it breaks him." She stepped closer, her presence steady as the ground beneath his feet. "Then let's not break it, Ben." The simplicity of her words unsettled him. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the billionaire CEO, not the woman who had once lived in a world untouchable. He saw a person willing to risk the same fear he carried, and for the first time he let himself imagine a future where Jacob's drawings weren't just wishes, but reflections of what they had built. One Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through the kitchen, Alexandra arrived with a basket of pastries. Ben was cooking eggs, Jacob sketching at the table. It felt startlingly ordinary. Jacob raised his head and declared, "We should go somewhere. Together. Like a real family." Ben chuckled. "Where to?" "The park," Jacob said firmly. "And don't say no. I already drew it." He held up a sketch, 3 figures on a picnic blanket beneath a wide tree, laughter in every line. Alexandra laughed softly, looking at Ben. "Seems he's already decided." Ben hesitated, spatula in hand, the smell of bacon filling the air. Then he smiled, small but genuine. "All right, champ, the park it is." It was a promise, a small step, but a step nonetheless. And for Jacob, it was everything. The park was alive with Sunday noise children chasing kites, couples sprawled on blankets, the smell of hot dogs drifting from a vendor's cart. Ben carried the picnic basket, its weight awkward but welcome. Alexandra walked beside him, her hand brushing his once lingering longer than accident allowed. Jacob skipped a few steps ahead, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, eyes wide as if cataloging every color, every laugh, every flicker of life. They found a quiet patch under a sprawling oak. Grass cushioned their steps, and sunlight dappled their faces. Jacob spread the blanket with a flourish, proud as though he'd laid out a royal feast. Ben lowered the basket. "All right, champ, your kingdom." "Not mine," Jacob corrected, grinning. "Ours." The word hung there weighty, undeniable. Alexandra's eyes glistened. They ate simply sandwiches, fruit pastries Alexandra insisted on buying. Conversation flowed easier than it ever had, full of Jacob's excited chatter and Alexandra's laughter that grew freer with every passing minute. Ben found himself smiling more than he realized, the sound of her laugh, stirring something he hadn't let himself feel in years. After lunch, Jacob sprawled across the blanket sketchbook balanced on his knees. He drew the oak tree, then the three of them beneath it. Every stroke of his pencil pressed deeper into truth. "Dad," he said without looking up, "you should smile more. You look better when you do." Ben chuckled, shaking his head. "Bossy, aren't you?" Jacob grinned. "Gets it from Ali." Alexandra pressed a hand to her heart, feigning offense. "Me?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Yeah, but it's good. We need it." Her laughter softened, turning into something like a sigh. She looked at Ben, her eyes saying what her lips didn't. "Don't you see? We already are what he drew." Later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in pink and amber, Jacob fell asleep against the blanket, pencil still in his hand. His breathing was steady, peaceful, in a way that made Ben's chest ache with gratitude. Ben watched him, then whispered, "I keep waiting for the world to take this away." Alexandra leaned closer, her voice steady. "It won't. Not if we hold it tight." He turned to her, torn. "And what about you? When the world starts pulling you back, you're bored, your business, the headlines." "What then?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "Then I'll choose again. And every time after that. Because this," she gestured to the boy, to the blanket, to the sketchbook lying open with its truth scrawled in graphite, "is the only thing that feels real." For a long moment, silence settled between them, broken only by birdsong and distant laughter. Ben wanted to believe her. More than that, he wanted to believe himself capable of holding on to it. Tentatively, he reached across the blanket and took her hand. His grip was rough, uncertain. Hers tightened gently, certain enough for them both. When Jacob stirred awake, he blinked at their joined hands and grinned. "Told you." Ben rolled his eyes. "Go back to sleep." But the boy only laughed, nestling closer. "You can't hide from drawings. They always tell the truth." Alexandra brushed a hand through Jacob's hair. "Then let's keep drawing." The boy yawned. "Together." And in that simple word lay everything they had fought for: the surgeries, the sleepless nights, the fears and doubts and broken promises. A family rebuilt not by accident, but by choice. As the last light of day fell across the park, Ben looked at Alexandra and saw not a billionaire, not a savior, but a woman who had chosen them as much as they had chosen her. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel dangerous. It felt like home. Your thoughts will help us create meaningful stories. And if you want to hear more powerful healing stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And most importantly, share this video with people who need a little hope today. Thank you so much for your time. We hear you, we listen to you, and we are honored to tell these stories for you.